Welcome back, you people who learned to stay calm in rooms that were never safe. People who stopped reacting because reacting only made it worse. People who were told you're fine while surviving things that weren't fine at all. Yes, you. This isn't for the dramatic. This isn't for the loud. This is for the ones who sit still while storms happen inside the house and outside the body. The ones who don't panic when voices rise. The ones who don't break when pressure builds. Now picture it. A cold room, bright lights, a desk, a screen, your name at the top of a file. They weren't there to comfort you. They weren't there to clap for your resilience. They ran your data through systems built to test people trained for war. Stress test, pain test, provocation test. They expected cracks. When the pressure sound hit, they expected your heart to spike. It didn't. When the hostile questions came, layered and sharp, they expected your breathing to shake. It didn't. When discomfort increased, slow and steady, they expected a visible flinch. You stayed still. Not frozen. Not numb. Still. They looked at the screen again, raised the level. Most people unravel when the heat rises. Their voice tightens. Their body shifts. Their emotions leak through the mask. You adjusted. That's it. Just adjusted. Like someone who has seen worse. The test wasn't about how strong you felt. It was about how stable you stayed when the environment turned hostile, and your numbers didn't scream trauma. They whispered control. They expected someone fragile. They found someone trained. Now here's the part that makes certain people uncomfortable. You were never trained. No boot camp. No drills. No instructors teaching you how to stay calm under fire. You learned it in places that don't give medals. Living rooms that felt like interrogation rooms. Conversations that felt like traps. Silence that felt like a loaded weapon. You learned that reacting made things worse. You learned that staying steady kept you alive. So your body adapted. It stopped overreacting. It started calculating. They ran your profile through combat metrics, systems meant to measure how someone behaves when chaos hits. Reaction time under stress. Emotional control when provoked. Pain tolerance when pressure rises. The results came back. Not chaotic. Not unstable. Not broken. Calm. Efficient. Contained. The analyst scrolled, paused, scrolled again. Because here's the truth no one likes to say out loud. Damage is messy. Discipline is quiet. They were prepared to diagnose damage. They were not prepared to see discipline in someone who never signed up for war. And that's when the room went quiet. Not because you scared them. Because they understood something. If you operate like this without training, then whatever built you was not small. And for the first time, the people who thought you were too serious or too distant would have hated that screen. Because the data didn't call you dramatic, it called you operational. The results made them go quiet, not fear. Recognition. And once the room went quiet, they didn't stop. They zoomed in. Because silence after data doesn't mean satisfaction. It means suspicion. They started looking for what they expected to find from the beginning. Rapid breathing patterns, micro tremors in the hands, eye movement spikes under stress. That's what long-term pressure usually leaves behind. A nervous system that fires too fast. A body that reacts before the mind can catch up. Fight or flight flipping on like a broken switch. They ran the playback again. Provocation sequence, sudden tone shift. unfair accusation layered into the question. Most people lean forward, defend, over-explain. Their pulse betrays them before their mouth does. Your breathing, even. Your pulse, stable. Your response time, not rushed, not delayed, measured. They increased emotional pressure. A pointed statement, a contradiction, a subtle attempt to corner you. They were watching for emotional spikes, that quick flare of anger, the tight jaw, the sharp inhale. Instead, what they saw was something else. You didn't react fast. You reacted last. That's not weakness. That's control. And here's the twist they didn't announce out loud. Chronic threat doesn't always break a system. Sometimes it refines it. When chaos is constant, the body learns efficiency. It stops wasting energy on panic. It starts conserving it for precision. You weren't jumping at shadows. You were scanning them. They were looking for fight or flight chaos. What they found was calibration. Controlled breathing under stress, emotion that moved slower than the stimulus, responses that felt chosen, not explosive, not desperate, chosen. They leaned back again. Because this is where their neat little expectations started cracking. Trauma is supposed to look unstable, loud, reactive. But what happens when someone survives long enough that their system adapts instead of collapses? What happens when the nervous system says, fine, if this is the environment, we optimize? That's what they were staring at, not fragility. Efficiency. And here's the part you already know, but nobody says clearly. Outside that room, they didn't call it efficiency. They called you too serious. They said you were emotionally distant. They whispered, damaged, when you didn't react the way they wanted. Because you didn't flinch at the small stuff. Because you didn't overshare your pain to make them comfortable. Because you didn't panic when they expected you to. They mistook your control for coldness. That's cute. In that room, there was no gossip, no opinions, just data. And the data didn't say damaged. It said trained. Not trained by instructors. Not trained in a facility. Trained by repetition. By learning that overreacting had consequences. By learning that staying steady kept things predictable. By learning that emotions, when shown too fast, were used against you. So your system slowed them down. Not because you don't feel. Because you learned timing. And that's what made the analyst go still. They were prepared to label symptoms. Instead, they were reading strategy. They zoomed into recovery time. That's where people usually slip. After stress hits, how long does it take to return to baseline? For most, it lingers. The body stays tense. The mind keeps replaying. Yours settled. Not instantly, not robotically, but efficiently, like someone who's had practice. And here's where the smirk creeps in. The same people who told you that you were shutting down. They would never survive the test you just passed quietly. They complain about pressure in meetings. You've survived pressure that didn't come with job titles. They call you guarded. You call it calibrated. They say you need to open up more. Open up to what? More unpredictability, more chaos. You already learned that lesson once. And now, sitting in that room, the truth was simple and impossible to ignore. They expected trauma markers. They found operational stability. They expected someone reactive. They found someone regulated. They expected damage. They found discipline. The silence wasn't dramatic. No gasps, no raised eyebrows, just a subtle shift in posture. Because when the numbers don't match the narrative people have about you, The narrative dies quietly, and the only thing left on the screen was this. You don't break the way they thought you would. You don't spike the way they hoped you did. You don't collapse under pressure. You adjust. And that realization, it settled into the room like something heavy. Not fear, respect. And respect is dangerous, because once someone sees what you are clearly, they can't pretend you're fragile anymore. They can't reduce you to a story that makes them comfortable. So let's keep walking backward for a second. Let's rewind to the part nobody put on a screen. Because you didn't wake up one day calibrated. You were built, not in a lab, not in a facility, not in some dramatic training montage with music and instructors yelling orders. Your training ground had couches, hallways, closed doors, kitchens that went silent too fast. Operatives train in secure compounds. You trained in living rooms. Operatives face-timed drills designed to simulate unpredictability. Yours was permanent. You didn't know which version of reality you were waking up to. Was today calm? Or was today the day something small exploded into something massive? You learned early that safety wasn't stable. It was conditional, and the conditions changed without warning. That's not poetry. That's repetition. You learned to read footsteps before words, the way a door closed, the way someone placed a glass on a table. Volume shifts, tone shifts, breathing changes. Conversations didn't feel like conversations. They felt like interrogations. Questions weren't just questions. They were traps, and answering too fast or too slow had consequences. So you adjusted. You stopped reacting instantly. You started calculating. Silence wasn't peaceful. It was loaded. It felt like a sniper scope scanning for movement. You learned that sometimes the safest move was no move at all. No meltdown. No dramatic collapse, just steady adaptation. Operatives are taught how to handle unpredictable scenarios. You lived inside one. They practice maintaining composure while instructors create stress on purpose. You maintained composure because stress was normal. There was no exercise over, no whistle, no debrief, no comforting explanation that it was all just part of the drill. It was just life. And here's where people get it wrong. They look at you now and say, "You're strong," like it's a compliment. But strength implies choice. It implies volunteering, raising your hand, signing a paper that says, "Yes, I accept these risks." You didn't choose. You adapted or you disappeared. That was the deal. Unspoken, constant. You learned to shrink your reactions because big reactions made things worse. You learned to slow your breathing because panic escalated the room. You learned to swallow words because some truths triggered explosions. So your nervous system got smarter. It stopped wasting energy on dramatic spikes. It started conserving energy for survival. That's the part they don't see when they say you're too controlled. They think it's personality. They think it's temperament. They think you were just born serious. No, you were trained. Not by mentors, by patterns. You noticed that when voices rose, chaos followed. So your body learned to stay low. You noticed that unpredictability had signals. So your mind started mapping them automatically. You weren't overthinking. You were predicting. Operatives rehearse threat detection in controlled environments. You rehearsed it every day without knowing you were rehearsing. And slowly, without ceremony, the upgrade began. Your breathing changed first. Instead of climbing with tension, it flattened. Instead of rushing to match the room, it held steady. Then your reactions changed. You stopped answering emotionally. You started answering strategically. Then your pain threshold changed. Not because you enjoyed pain, because pain became background noise. When discomfort is constant, it loses its ability to shock you. That's not toughness. That's adaptation. And here's the part that hits the enemy hard, even if they'll never admit it. The same people who benefited from your calm are the ones who now call you distant. The same people who leaned on your stability are the ones who say you're hard to read. They loved your composure when it protected them. They resent it when it protects you. You didn't wake up cold. You learned that heat burned you. You didn't wake up guarded. You learned that openness had a cost. Operatives are told what they're preparing for. You had no briefing, no warning that this environment would shape your nervous system into something tactical. But the human body is brilliant under pressure. It doesn't wait for permission to survive. It upgrades automatically. When chaos repeats, the brain searches for patterns. When danger repeats, the body searches for efficiency. So without you announcing it, without you deciding consciously, the system adjusted. Your pulse stopped racing at every raised voice. Your eyes started catching micro changes in expression. Your mind started calculating outcomes before conversations even ended. Not because you wanted to be hyper-aware, because being unaware was dangerous. And now, years later, people think this is just who you are. They don't realize it was forged. It was built through repetition. It was coded through necessity. You didn't choose to become this steady. You became steady because instability was constant. And by the time anyone thought to call you strong, the upgrade was complete. Your nervous system had already decided. Panic is inefficient. Emotion without timing is risky. Reaction without calculation is dangerous. So it built something better, something quieter, something controlled. And that's the version that sat in that evaluation room. Not dramatic, not broken, just refined. An operating system shaped by pressure, running smoothly under heat. Not because you signed up, because you survived. And that's the version that sat in that evaluation room. Not dramatic, not broken, just refined. An operating system shaped by pressure, running smoothly under heat. But they weren't done measuring. Pain tolerance was only the surface layer. That's the part people like to romanticize. Wow, you can handle a lot. Cute, that's entry level. So they went deeper. Combat metrics don't just test how much you can endure, they test how well you can read the field. Threat assessment, pattern recognition, emotional containment, recovery time. They loaded the next sequence. Subtle facial shifts flashed across the screen, micro-expressions most people miss, a half-second tightening around the eyes, a barely noticeable jaw clench, a tone that dips before a lie. They were measuring how fast you detect change. Most people don't notice the shift until the damage is done. They feel blindsided, betrayed, shocked. You noticed before it finished forming. Your eyes moved slightly before the stimulus peaked. Your response aligned with the shift before it was obvious. They marked it. High threat detection accuracy. Then came layered contradiction. A statement that didn't match previous data. Inconsistency built into the conversation on purpose. Most people get confused. They try to reconcile the mismatch emotionally. You didn't look confused. You recalculated. Pattern recognition score elevated. See, when instability is long-term, the brain stops reacting randomly. It starts predicting. It scans for irregularities the way other people scan for compliments. You learned to read tone before content, to catch the hesitation before the lie, to feel the room tighten before the explosion, not because you're suspicious by nature, because missing it once cost you. So your system upgraded. The analyst scrolled further. Emotional suppression. Now that word sounds ugly to people who've never needed it. They imagine numbness, disconnection, something unhealthy. But what they were measuring wasn't absence of emotion. It was control over timing. Stimulus presented, emotional trigger applied. You didn't spill. You didn't rush to defend. You didn't escalate. You waited. Response latency. Intentional. That's not shut down. That's discipline. And then recovery time. After pressure spikes, how fast does the system return to baseline? Do you carry the tension for hours? Days? Does it leak into everything else? Your graph rose. Then it dropped, efficiently. The room got quiet again, because this wasn't just high pain tolerance. This was field awareness. This was someone whose brain had been living in unpredictable terrain for so long, it learned to map it in real time. And outside that room, they call you paranoid. Paranoid. That's rich. They've never had to predict danger before breakfast. They've never had to scan faces at the table and calculate who's about to shift. They've never had to read silence like it's a warning label, and they think you're always on edge. You're not on edge. You're informed. They call it overthinking. You call it pattern recognition. You notice when someone's voice goes slightly flat before they withdraw. You notice when affection turns conditional. You notice when the story changes by a single detail. Most people ignore those signs because their environment has never punished them for missing them. Yours did. So your brain learned to catch them early. Not dramatically. Not anxiously. Precisely. That's what the metrics showed. High threat anticipation. Accurate inconsistency detection. Stable emotional output under pressure. Quick return to calm. This isn't someone flailing in trauma. This is someone who learned to navigate instability so well it became automatic. The analyst stared at the screen a little longer than necessary. Because here's the part that doesn't fit into neat categories. When someone grows up in unpredictability, their brain becomes predictive. It doesn't wait for explosions. It reads the fuse. It doesn't wait for betrayal. It reads the setup. And when that skill is refined long enough, it stops looking like fear. It looks like composure. Outside the room, they say you're too aware. Inside the room, the data says you're calibrated. Outside, they say you analyze everything. Inside, the system shows high situational accuracy. Outside, they roll their eyes and say, it's not that serious. Inside, the metrics say you rarely misread danger. That difference matters. Because now the story shifts. This isn't about enduring pain anymore. This is about navigating chaos with precision. You didn't just survive instability. You studied it. You didn't just tolerate discomfort. You mapped it. And the people who think you're intense, they've had the luxury of ignorance. They get surprised by things you saw coming 3 steps earlier. They think your caution is negativity. You know it's data. The analyst closed one window, opened another, cross-checked against baseline civilian averages. You didn't land in the middle. You landed in ranges usually seen in people trained to operate under sustained stress. No badge, no uniform, no official training, just repetition. And now the numbers were undeniable. They expected fragility hidden under calm. They found structure hidden under silence. They expected someone reactive beneath the surface. They found someone predictive. And that's when it stopped being about whether you were okay It became about understanding what kind of environment creates someone who can read danger this cleanly without formal training. Because pain tolerance is one thing, but seeing the storm before the clouds gather, that's something else entirely. And that realization, it didn't make them afraid. It made them careful. It made them careful. And that's when the room changed. Not loudly, no dramatic music, no gasp, just a small shift in posture. The analyst leaned back in their chair, eyes still on the screen, hands resting but not relaxed. No jokes, no soft smile, no quick label to make it simple. Just recalibration, because up until that moment, this was supposed to be routine. Run the profile, confirm the assumptions, stamp it with a tidy explanation. Instead, the numbers kept refusing to cooperate. Combat-level stress control, high-threat anticipation, efficient recovery, minimal emotional leakage under pressure, in a civilian file. That doesn't scare professionals. It unsettles them. Because it means one thing. This person survived something sustained. Not a bad week, not a rough breakup, not a dramatic chapter you can summarize in a paragraph. Sustained. Long enough for the body to adapt. Long enough for the nervous system to stop hoping it would end and start preparing for it to continue. The analyst wasn't looking at you like you were dangerous. They were looking at you like you were forged. And here's where it gets interesting. Outside that room, there were people who said, it wasn't that bad. They minimized it, shrugged it off, told you that you were exaggerating, that you were too sensitive, that you needed to let it go. In that room, the numbers disagreed. Data doesn't care about their comfort. It doesn't adjust itself to protect someone's ego. It doesn't soften edges to keep family narratives intact. It doesn't say, let's make this easier to digest. It measures output under pressure. And the output said this wasn't mild. If it had been mild, your system wouldn't be this optimized. If it had been small, your threat detection wouldn't be this sharp. If it had been normal, your recovery curves wouldn't look like someone trained to operate under sustained stress. The people who said, you turned out fine, they should have been in that room. Because fine doesn't produce these metrics. Fine doesn't build this kind of control. Fine doesn't create a nervous system that moves like this under pressure. The analyst scrolled one more time, compared your file to others, typical civilian baseline. Then your data. The gap wasn't subtle. You weren't sitting in average range. You weren't slightly elevated. You were sitting in a bracket usually reserved for people who have undergone structured conditioning for high-stress environments. And here's the quiet part that lands heavy. You never had structured conditioning. You had repetition. Repetition is a brutal teacher. It doesn't explain. It doesn't comfort. It just applies pressure until adaptation happens. And adaptation happened. The analyst understood that now. This wasn't someone who panics easily. This wasn't someone fragile under the surface. This wasn't someone dramatic. This was someone who learned to function when function was the only safe option. That's why the room went quiet again. Not out of fear. Out of recognition. Recognition that the story told outside that room didn't match the evidence inside it. Recognition that whatever shaped you did so consistently enough to leave measurable marks. Recognition that this level of calibration doesn't come from nothing. And that's the part that would make certain people uncomfortable. Because if the metrics show sustained adaptation, then the environment that created it wasn't harmless. If the system is this refined, then the pressure wasn't light. The people who insisted, you're overreacting, the screen would have exposed them. The ones who said, that's just how things were. The data would have disagreed politely, but firmly. The numbers don't argue. They just show patterns. And your pattern said survival. Sustained survival. The analyst didn't rush to write anything, didn't jump to conclusions. They just sat there for a moment longer than necessary, absorbing what the file actually meant. Because once you see it clearly, you can't pretend it's ordinary. They closed one window, left the main graph open, the lines steady, the responses clean, the recovery smooth. Then they leaned back again. No diagnosis spoken, no dramatic conclusion, just a quiet understanding settling into the space. This wasn't damage in the chaotic sense. This was discipline born under pressure. And the room went quiet one more time. And the room went quiet one more time. But silence has layers. There's the silence of recognition. And then there's the silence of implication. Because once you admit that someone has been calibrated under pressure, you also admit something else. Calibration has a cost. Let's keep walking. The analyst understood what the numbers meant. High control, high awareness, fast recovery, efficient threat detection. Impressive. But systems built for survival don't just switch off because the room is calm. Permanent survival mode doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't look like screaming or shaking. It looks like stillness. When crisis hits, you don't panic. You go still. Everyone else talks faster, moves louder, reacts bigger. You slow down. You narrow focus. You calculate. That's not bravery. That's familiarity. Crisis doesn't shock you. It activates something you've used before. And outside that room, people misunderstand that completely. They say, "You're too quiet." You're not quiet. You're assessing. You don't overshare. You don't spill your thoughts the second they form. You measure the room first. You check tone. You scan faces. You decide what's safe to release. That's not secrecy. That's mapping. You don't attach blindly. You map exits, not because you plan to run, because you've learned that knowing your options keeps you steady. And here's the darker edge no one claps for. The system that saved you doesn't power down easily. You can leave the chaos. You can change the environment. You can build something stable. But the wiring stays alert. You run wartime software in peacetime rooms. You walk into a gathering and instinctively scan the dynamic. Who's tense? Who's shifting? Who's about to clash? You sit at dinner and notice the micro changes in tone that others miss. You relax, but not fully. Because full relaxation requires a kind of trust your body was never given proof of. And this is where people get it twisted. They complain about inconvenience, traffic, delayed messages, minor conflicts. You've managed collapse. They call you intense because you don't spiral over small things. Small things don't register the same way for you. Your threshold moved years ago. They call you cold. You call it efficient. Efficiency doesn't waste emotion on noise. Efficiency conserves energy for what matters. You don't overreact to inconvenience because your system learned the difference between discomfort and danger. And here's the truth they won't say out loud. Your calm under pressure exposes their fragility. When you don't panic, it highlights how quickly they do. When you don't crumble, it reminds them how easily they might. So they soften it. They label you distant. They say you need to open up more. Open up to what? Chaos? Instability? Emotional volatility for the sake of relatability? No. You're not closed. You're calibrated. But calibration comes with weight. You don't get startled easily. You don't get swept up easily. You don't trust blindly. You observe first. That means fewer surprises. It also means fewer illusions. You see the cracks early. You sense the shift before the shift is obvious, and that makes some people uncomfortable because you don't participate in denial the way they do. They want you to react louder. You react smarter. They want you to feel everything immediately. You feel it. You just don't display it instantly. And yes, sometimes that means you feel alone in rooms full of people. Because when you're running survival-grade awareness in everyday life, you notice things others don't. You see tension building before it breaks. You hear tone changes before the argument starts. You detect instability long before it becomes visible. That awareness keeps you safe. It also keeps you slightly separate. No pity, just clarity. The system that formed under sustained pressure became your default. It made you steady. It made you precise. It also made you cautious. And caution, to people who've never needed it, looks excessive. They've had the luxury of assuming things will be fine. You've had proof that sometimes they're not. So when they call you guarded, understand something. You didn't build walls for drama. You built structure for stability. And when they say you're hard to read, understand this too. You're not hard to read. You're just not leaking. There's a difference. The analyst in that room didn't see coldness. They saw control. They didn't see distance. They saw discipline. They didn't see someone broken by chaos. They saw someone shaped by it. And shaping leaves marks, not scars that bleed, edges that hold. You don't panic in crisis. You go still. You don't overshare. You assess. You don't attach blindly. You map exits. That's the cost and the power of calibration. And the world that calls you too much for it, it benefits from your stability more than it will ever admit. It benefits from your stability more than it will ever admit. And that's where the story shifts again. Because strength is admired until it becomes inconvenient. At first, they liked it. They liked that you didn't explode. They liked that you handled things. They liked that you could take it. You became the steady one, the reliable one, the one who doesn't crumble when things get messy. And slowly, quietly, they started leaning heavier. Not all at once. That would be obvious. Just a little more responsibility here, a little more emotional weight there, a little more expectation. Because you didn't break. And when someone doesn't break, people assume they can carry more. They assumed your silence meant consent. They assumed your composure meant comfort. They assumed your endurance meant agreement. That's the part that turns ugly. You weren't okay with everything. You just knew reacting loudly wouldn't change it. But they interpreted calm as approval. They interpreted tolerance as acceptance. They mistook survival for permission. And here's where the venom comes in. They praised your resilience so they wouldn't have to change. You're so strong. Translation. You can handle it, so I don't have to adjust. You're so mature. Translation. You'll absorb the impact, so I don't have to feel it. You're the stable one. Translation. I get to stay chaotic. They handed you weight and called it trust. They leaned into your capacity and called it love. They used your control as a cushion for their lack of it. Because calibration under threat creates high capacity. And high capacity attracts exploitation. Not because you're weak, because you're capable. People gravitate towards stability. They offload onto it. They depend on it. And if they're not careful, they abuse it. You didn't complain loudly, so they kept going. You didn't collapse, so they increased the pressure. You didn't panic, so they assumed it didn't hurt. And that's the part that would never show up on the screen in that evaluation room. The data showed discipline, It didn't show the quiet moments where you carried more than you should have. It didn't show the times you absorbed impact because someone else couldn't regulate themselves. It didn't show how often your restraint saved relationships that weren't balanced. But make no mistake, your restraint was strength. It just wasn't strength for them. They called you mature when they meant easy to burden. They called you understanding when they meant won't fight back. They called you low maintenance when they meant won't demand better. That's not admiration. That's convenience. And convenience has a way of disguising itself as praise. But here's the twist they didn't see coming. Calibration doesn't just increase tolerance. It increases awareness. The same system that let you endure also let you observe. You noticed patterns. You noticed who leaned hardest. You noticed who never recalibrated themselves because you absorbed the shock. You noticed who depended on your control so they wouldn't have to develop their own. And one day, something shifts. Not dramatically, not explosively, just a quiet internal adjustment. You stop carrying what isn't yours. You stop absorbing what doesn't belong to you. You stop confusing endurance with obligation. Because here's the truth that cuts. You were not strong for their benefit. You were surviving in spite of them. You weren't calm to make their lives easier. You were calm to keep yourself intact. You weren't controlled so they could stay chaotic. You were controlled because chaos once had consequences. And once that realization locks in, something changes in the way you stand. You don't argue louder. You withdraw weight. You don't demand dramatically. You recalibrate your access. High capacity doesn't mean unlimited capacity. And the moment you stop overextending it, that's when the people who relied on it feel the difference. They'll call you different. They'll say, you've changed. You have. Not because you became colder, because you became intentional. And that's where the real power begins to show. Not in how much you can endure, but in how much you choose not to. You were not strong for their benefit. You were surviving in spite of them. You were not strong for their benefit. You were surviving in spite of them. And once that clicks, the whole board changes. Let's go back to that room for a second. Back to the screen. Back to the numbers glowing quietly like they're minding their business. Pain tolerance was just one number. 1. People obsess over that one because it sounds dramatic. You can handle pain. Sure, fine. But what comes with that level of tolerance? Composure, strategic silence, emotional containment, detached clarity under pressure. Those don't show up by accident. When your system learns to survive sustained instability, it doesn't just increase endurance. It upgrades perception. It refines timing. It sharpens restraint. And that's the part they didn't calculate. Because endurance alone is useful. Endurance with awareness, that's dangerous. You don't argue loudly. You let people reveal themselves. You've learned that most people will talk themselves into exposure if you just stay still long enough. When someone lies, exaggerates, manipulates, or overplays their hand, they usually expect resistance. They expect noise. You give them quiet. And in that quiet, they keep talking. You don't chase validation. You observe behavior. You stopped asking people to prove they care with words. Words are cheap. You watch patterns. You watch consistency. You watch what happens when pressure is applied, because pressure reveals structure. And you've seen enough collapses to know that not everything standing is stable. You don't react fast. You respond last. When tension rises in a room, most people rush to fill it. They defend, they accuse, they explain, they panic. You lean back. You measure. You calculate what matters and what doesn't. That delay, it unnerves people because fast reactions are predictable. Slow responses are controlled, and control makes some people uncomfortable. They mistake calm for weakness. That's adorable. They see you not exploding and assume you can't. They see you not defending yourself immediately and assume you don't have the words. They see you not panicking and assume you don't understand the stakes. They don't realize you've already run 3 outcomes in your head before they finish their sentence. They don't realize you've mapped their pattern weeks ago. They don't realize silence, for you, isn't confusion. It's strategy. Back in that evaluation room, the metrics weren't just measuring how much you could take. They were measuring how you moved under strain. And what they found was someone who doesn't flail, someone who doesn't bleed emotion across the floor, someone who holds center when things tilt. That's not numbness. That's training by repetition. But here's where the villain transformation locks in. At some point, you stop seeing your calibration as something that just happened to you. You start seeing it as something you can direct. Before, you survived on instinct. Now, you operate on intention. Before, the system activated automatically because it had to. Now, you choose when to deploy it. You choose when to engage. You choose when to withdraw. You choose who gets access to your capacity. And that shift, that's power. Not loud power. Not dramatic power. Contained power. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that lets others underestimate it. You don't need to dominate a room. You just need to understand it. You don't need to win every argument. You just need to know which ones matter. You don't need everyone to like you. You need to know who's predictable and who isn't. The upgrade they didn't calculate wasn't your pain tolerance. It was your clarity. Pain strips illusions. Instability teaches you what's real. Repeated pressure removes fantasy. And once illusions fall away, you start seeing people exactly as they are. No projection, no romanticized versions, just patterns. And when you see patterns clearly, you stop being surprised. That's why you don't chase people. That's why you don't beg to be understood. That's why you don't rush to fix every misunderstanding. If someone misreads you because you're calm, let them. If someone underestimates you because you're quiet, let them. They think calm means passive. They think stillness means harmless. They think restraint means incapable. That's adorable. Because the same system that learned to survive chaos also learned when not to waste energy. And once you stop proving yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you, something shifts in the air around you. You don't shrink. You don't harden. You refine. The analyst in that room saw numbers. What they didn't fully grasp was this. You are no longer just someone who endured pressure. You are someone who understands it. And when you understand pressure, you can apply it. Carefully, strategically, without raising your voice. That's the upgrade. And most people won't see it coming until they're already standing in it. And now we return to that room one last time. The screen is still glowing. The lines are still steady. The numbers haven't changed. Nothing dramatic happened after the silence. No alarms. No red flags, no emergency response, just understanding. The analyst didn't look shaken, they looked recalibrated. Because when someone reaches combat-level calibration without formal training, it forces a different question. Not what's wrong with them, but what built them. And more importantly, what happens when someone like that becomes intentional? The results were undeniable. Pain tolerance above average, Threat detection precise. Emotional control measured, not suppressed. Recovery efficient. No chaos, no fragmentation, just structure. The silence in that room wasn't fear. It was recalculation. Because discipline without training means adaptation under pressure. And adaptation under pressure means something sustained shaped you. But here's the part that matters now. Back then, you adapted automatically. You didn't sit down and say, "Let me upgrade my nervous system." You didn't volunteer to become controlled, observant, measured. You were forged by accident. The pressure did the shaping. The repetition did the refining. The instability did the sharpening. You didn't choose the fire. You survived it, and survival forced the upgrade. But now you're not reacting blindly anymore. Now you're not just absorbing and enduring. Now you see the system for what it is. You see your stillness. You see your timing. You see your ability to read rooms, hold composure, move deliberately. And here's the shift. When calibration becomes conscious, it becomes power. Before, your control was defense. Now, it's direction. Before, your silence was protection. Now, it's presence. Before, your awareness was survival. Now, it's strategy. The analyst in that room saw someone who operates like they've been trained for pressure.